right, so welcome back for another midweek with Double Creek. Right now we're in week 17 out of our 52 weeks in our 52 weeks with Jesus. And so we're still in this third section of the book. The third section of the book is titled Jesus the Miracle Worker, and we will be in this section for this week and next week, and then we'll move into the fourth section of the book. But for the last 6 weeks in this third section of the book, Jesus the Miracle Worker, we've been looking at some miracles that were performed by Jesus. We've seen great faith in this little section. We've seen great healing, and ultimately we've seen great and fantastic miracles. But as we have pointed out a couple different times during this series, the miracles that were performed by Jesus ultimately were done so that God the Father would be glorified. Now, today we're looking at the divine ophthalmologist. Now, if I were to ask you what an ophthalmologist is, what do they do? Simply put, an ophthalmologist is someone who is qualified, someone who specializes in working with eye care or vision. So they may do eye screenings, they may do a surgery, they'll do whatever needs to be done really to help us to have the best quality care so that we can see well and have good eyesight. Now, knowing that an ophthalmologist is someone who works with eyesight, and the title of today's lesson, The Divine Ophthalmologist, and knowing that the lesson is about a miracle performed by Jesus, which miracle do you think we might be looking at today? This one is definitely easier than last week's, but today we're looking at the miracle where Jesus healed a man who had been blind since birth. Now, this story takes place in John chapter 9, and it covers the entire chapter, which is 41 verses. And so, with that being said, we will not be reading the entire chapter today. There are lots of this story in the second half that we're, the middle of the story, the second half of the story that we're not really going to be talking about today. But as we go along today, we're going to be hitting on some particular verses, some particular parts of this story. And the reason for that is because this story, this lesson, this chapter could have multiple lessons within it. Understandably so. When you have 41 verses there that deal with one story, there's a lot involved. And so in this story, there is a man who is born blind who is healed. He becomes a man who believes in Jesus as being Jesus the Christ, the Son of Man. You probably see other people who believe as well. Then you have those Pharisees who seem to be around so often when Jesus was performing a miracle, who did not believe that Jesus was the Christ, who he claimed to be. And then another part of this story is the fact that this miracle takes place on the Sabbath. And so with this miracle taking place on the Sabbath, this was a big no-no to these Pharisees. Because to them, healing someone was work. And no work was allowed to be done on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus cleared up that line of thinking in the Scriptures, especially in Matthew chapter 3, that it was not work and the healing on the Sabbath is the perfect thing that you should do. But yeah, there are plenty of different lessons that we could learn in this chapter, John chapter 9, from this story. But our focus today is going to be on the divine ophthalmologist, Jesus, and what it is he does in this chapter. And so in this chapter, Merritt starts off by talking about spiritual blindness. Spiritual blindness is something that is clearly evident in our world. But if we really stop and think about it, it's always been that way. Spiritual blindness, it's nothing new. In simple terms, spiritual blindness is not being able to see Christ, and since you can't see Christ, you can't see God either, or come to know God. And so spiritual blindness is experienced really by people who fail to believe that Jesus is the Christ. St. Augustine, he lived around the 4th and 5th centuries, and he's credited by some with being an early, very important father to the early church during his day and time. St. Augustine, his father was a pagan. Augustine's mother, though, was a Christian. And there's a story about Augustine that Merritt mentions in this chapter early on about how a man who was a pagan came to Augustine with his idol in his hands, and he said, "Here is my God, where is yours?" To which Augustine just replied, "I cannot show you my God. Not because there is no God to show you, but because you have no eyes to see him." And I think that's just the perfect response when people use the fact that they cannot see God. The thing is, they cannot see, they cannot know God because they don't open their eyes. They don't open their hearts so that they can see God. Spiritual blindness. It's always been there. It will always be there. It was there in the first century when this man who was born blind, and other events as well in the first century. It was there well before Jesus came to earth as a human. It was there in the days of Augustine. It's here in our day, and it'll always be here because there are simply people who are not willing to open their eyes, open their hearts so that they can see Jesus. So in the Bible, in John chapter 9, you can read that entire story of the man who was born blind. Obviously not the entire story of his entire life, but the entire story of this miracle that Jesus performed. He was blind from the moment that he was pulled from his mother's womb. From the very moment that human hands first touched him, he was blind. And this was something about being blind like that, something that I can't imagine and that many of you probably cannot imagine either. Can you imagine just going through a day, through a week, or a month, not being able to see? That everything around is just dark to you. Now, I know there are people that can have procedures done on their eyes, and maybe they have to wear a patch or they can't see for a period of time, but they usually are made known that within a few hours, within a day or so, your vision will start coming back to you. It'll just maybe be blurry. Now, in our day and age, when we think about someone who was born blind, when we think about someone maybe who has lost their sight later on in life, how do we typically think about that person? I think to us, we just try to understand that it's a very unfortunate situation. And so we just look at it as really a terrible way to have to live and go through life. And so we try to have compassion on people who are going through something difficult like that. But in the first century, they didn't just have compassion like that. They didn't just think about it in that way. Even Christians in the first century, even people who loved and followed God. In the first century, if you had some type of debilitating condition, whether it was blindness, whether it was being deaf, whether it was being paralyzed, leprosy, or some other major illness, the only hope that you had in life of being somewhat successful was if you had family members who looked after you, or a close friend of the family who helped look after you and take care of you. In reality, a person with this type of condition, they were looked at as a burden, sometimes as a curse. Their mindset, that way of thinking, was to say that God had cursed this person because of something that either he had done or someone in their family had done. Well, for the man that we encounter here in the 9th chapter of John, as I've stated, he was blind from the moment that he was born. It was difficult on his family, no doubt. It was difficult on him. Just think for us for a second about how much we love to just step outside and look at God's beautiful handiwork. You know, you can go on a vacation to the beach. A lot of people love going to the beach on vacation. You can sit there at the beach on the sand or on your balcony, and you can just watch the waves come in and go out over and over. It's beautiful to watch. You can go to the mountains, and you can look out over the different ranges and tops of the mountains and just look at how beautiful God's creation is. You can think about the seasons of the year. You've got your summertime where everything is hot and warm and you're out enjoying vacations and different things, but then fall comes. And with fall comes things beginning to die, but before they die off, there's the beautiful scenery of leaves that are changing colors. Well, then winter comes along. And although winter is cold and snow can be difficult for us to travel in at times, how beautiful is it, though, to just watch the snowfall. And then after the winter, spring begins to come along. And things start blooming again. They start coming back to life. Buds start coming out of the trees. Flowers begin to pop up. The birds are out in the morning and you hear them chirping. You know, you have just experienced, when it comes to spring, this whole time of late fall into winter of things that were dying. Now to just have things coming back to life in the spring. They're all beautiful. They're beautiful sights to see. But imagine if you didn't have the sight to see all those things. Imagine if you didn't have the sight to ever see that in life. Knowing what all of these things look like now, if we were to lose our sight, I would think that we would begin to understand how much we would miss those things. Well, this man in John chapter 9, he enters this world in complete darkness. He enters this world in complete desperation. As I said, from the moment he was born and continued to grow and became an adult, he always had to have someone there by his side taking care of him. He was desperate, you could say. But this man who was born blind had never met Jesus until this day. Now, what we have kind of seen in this third section, Jesus the miracle worker, is that when people met Jesus and these miracles took place, they were amazed. Today, in our day and time, we meet Jesus when we decide to commit our life to becoming a Christian. We become a follower of Jesus Christ. We put our faith in Him. We repent. We're baptized. We're living a life that's worthy. And so we come to know Jesus in that way as our Lord and Savior. And although we may not experience the immediate miracles and Jesus touching us or talking to us in the way that they were talked to, even today we still experience complete changes, complete transformation because of Jesus. For this man in John chapter 9, at this time most of the world still had no idea who Jesus was. He had only been in this small area of the world. Many people in the world had never seen him. They had probably never even heard about all the things he was able to do. And so for us today, that world, we look at it now. We think, man, there were a lot of spiritually blind people then. They didn't know. But for us today, there are many people that don't have Jesus in their lives. They've never seen him. They've never come to know Jesus. And they are living in spiritual darkness, spiritual blindness. And let me just go ahead and say that just showing up to church, just sitting in a church pew or a seat, hearing a sermon, singing some songs, that does not mean that we know Jesus. Because people, we can go to church, we can sing, we can hear a great message, we can pray, we can do all those things, and we can still be spiritually blind as to what God can do for us through Jesus Christ. In life, we could have 20/20 vision, and we could still be spiritually blind. And so people who refuse to believe in Jesus, people who refuse to follow Jesus, they don't just have some physical problem in their lives, they have a spiritual problem, spiritual blindness. And so when we look at this story in John chapter 9, the question becomes, what did he do to deserve this? And I think it's a great question because of what I've already mentioned earlier about the way that they looked, the way they thought in that first century about people who had some type of sickness. People who knew this blind man, people who lived around there, they simply believed that a physical disability had to do with either that person sinning or someone in their family or their parents sinning or something. Well, in this case, it obviously did not have to do with his parent, with his sinning. It obviously did not have to do with him sinning because he was born from birth. He never had a chance to do wrong in his heart and mind. He never had a chance to sin. But in their mind, in that first century, people were handicapped this way by God because of something that was done that was either spiritually or morally corrupt. And so that's why we read this in the second verse. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? You see, this was not just the thought for people that don't believe in God. This question was asked by the disciples of Jesus, his closest followers. A question for us to think about, though, might be this. Why would they think this way? Why would the Jewish people think that God punished people for some sin that was done previously? And Merritt doesn't talk about it in this chapter or in this book, but I was just thinking about this while I was reading the chapter and studying, and so I may not have the perfect answer for you, but I think it goes back to something that people call divine retribution. Maybe you've heard of it and maybe you haven't, but in divine retribution, it's believed that there is a supernatural punishment for a person, for a people, or for an entire group of people, or everyone. But this punishment comes from a deity, from a God, in response to some action. So, when you're asking why these people in the first century, the Jewish people, thought this way, think back to things from the Old Testament. Because right now, while this was going on, this story with the man born blind and Jesus, right now in this story, they're still in the Old Testament. No New Testament had been written yet. They're still living by those days. They've gotten their law from the Old Testament. They've learned from the Old Testament stories about Israel, about how Israel was formed. They've learned the background to the story of Israel. Well, in Genesis, if you go back all the way to Genesis, you see things like Noah and the flood, God destroying the world by flood. You also see a story in Genesis about Sodom and Gomorrah, which we hit on a couple of weeks ago in our Abraham series here on Sunday mornings. God had to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and those cities because of corruption, because of wickedness and evil. Throughout the Old Testament, after the nation of Israel was formed, they continually turned their backs on God. And what did God have to do at times? There were times where God had to punish them as a nation. There were times where God even had to place them in exile as a nation. And so God allowed pagan nations, pagan kings, to destroy them in battle and take them over. You saw God several times have to punish a corrupt society, a corrupt people. And when you think about the time of Jesus here, when he heals the man who was born blind, even at this time, the nation of Israel was still ruled by Rome. So when you think about it, no wonder they had this mindset, this divine retribution mindset. Because for the most part, what they had seen, what they had heard, was that when God's creation lives against his will, God has to punish them in some way at times. So it would make sense that they would have this divine retribution way of thinking. This way of thinking that this person must have sinned, or someone in their family must have sinned for them to be going through this. And so when people saw someone during those days in the condition of the man born blind, it was common for people to ask a question like, I wonder what this person did to deserve it. They just assumed that a physical handicap was a sign that God wasn't happy with something that they had done or not done. But Jesus makes it clear here in this chapter that this is not the case. It's not what happens at all. His disciples, they asked this question in verse 2, and then we read this in verse 3. Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. And so here's what we can really see in this statement right here from Jesus. This man was not born blind because of anything he did or because of anything his parents did wrong. He was born blind so that God's work might be revealed. And so what we really see in this statement is, as we've mentioned a few times in our series, in this section right here, is that when Jesus performed a miracle, He did it so that God the Father would be glorified. And that's what you're really seeing Jesus kind of say here. That God was going to be glorified through this. And I love what Merritt says in this book. He's like, as Jesus' response showed us, a place of desperation is a setting for God's transformation. And I think it would be amazing if we could think about that when we're going through difficult times in life. That when we're in a desperate situation in life, when we're in a point where it seems like everything we're doing is wrong, that we cannot get it together, that we don't know what to do, we can also look at it as an opportunity for God to transform us, for God to show up big time. We here at Double Creek Church of Christ, we're not in a state of desperation as a church right now. But I do believe that God is still showing up in a big way right now with Trail Life that we just started. There's a great need for young boys in our world to be led by godly men. Especially in a time right now where our young boys are told over and over through TV, through social media, through the school system, whatever, where our young boys are being told that they need to follow the way the world does it. That they have to learn to accept this. And so there's a great need for young boys to learn from godly men in our world. And that's what Trail Life brings us. And when we started talking about Trail Life just a few months ago here at our church earlier this year, and with the thought of whether we should do it or not, we just had a hope that we would start with 5 or 10 young boys. Sure, we would want more and we would gladly take more, but we would have been happy if we could have just started with 10. Well, we had our first official meeting here this past Monday, and we're going to be meeting each Monday at 7 o'clock here at Double Creek Church of Christ. We had our first official meeting 2 days ago, and we had 35 young boys. We had 11 boys just show up with their parents on Monday night who just came to register and be a part of it. And what we're really seeing is that God will transform things if we just allow Him to do the work. That's not to say that we didn't have many of the men and fathers in the background or in the forefront of this doing lots of work and putting hours of work in. But overall, it's God that is working throughout the situation. And so as Merritt puts it in this chapter, believing is seeing. So what happens next in this story? After Jesus said a few more words, we then read this in verses 6 through 7. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The old saying that we might hear is, seeing is believing. Because we've kind of been trained as people, we've kind of been trained as a society that you can't believe in something unless you first see it. And it's how people think about God. So there are plenty of people who choose not to believe in God simply because they can't see God. But yet at the same time, many of those same people will believe in a theory, an evolution theory, which they cannot see. They can't see it taking place. Because apparently it takes place over millions of years. So they can't prove it, they can't see it, but they'll believe in something they can't see there, but not in a supreme being. So we've kind of been trained. Some people have been almost forced to think that you have to see something to believe it. And so it's probably why so many people in our world would rather pray to some man-made god or idol simply because they can see it, they can touch it, they can move it, they can carry it. But here we see the opposite in this story. In this story, it's not seeing is believing. It's believing is seeing. Because Jesus spits on the ground. He makes mud out of that with the saliva and the dirt. He rubs it on the man's eyes and he's healed, right? Well, not so fast. Because first he had to go to the pool of Siloam. He had to go to this pool, and then he had to wash it off. And then and only then could he be healed. And so what does this man do? like others that we have seen throughout this section of this third section, Jesus the miracle worker, this man had the faith to go and do what Jesus told him to do. He went and he washed, and he came back seeing. This man easily could have just said no. He could have said, what's the point? Just take care of it here. But remember, this man was desperate. So he listens to Jesus. He believes Jesus. He does what he says, and he comes back seeing. Nobody else in this man's life had offered him a cure. Nobody else could help. But when Jesus came along, he believed, and then he saw. And if people want lives to be transformed by Jesus, we have to believe what he has said. We have to believe what he has said in his word. We have to believe that Jesus can do what Jesus can do for us, in us, and through us, and then we can be transformed. Simply put, we need to receive what Jesus has. What does a blind person need or want? They want their sight restored. What does someone who is in darkness need? They need light. So when I take my dog Callaway out every night, or when Terry does, or whatever, when we take our dog out at night, we turn the lights on outside. Take a flashlight with us. Not because he can't see, but because we can't see. Well, Jesus here says it in this chapter, once again, as he had said other places, he is the light of the world. And the light of the world gave this man born blind sight. And you would think that when this happened, everybody who was around there, everybody that knew this person would be excited, would be thrilled, jumping up and down. But instead what you get is people just asking questions, trying to determine if this was even real, trying to just get an explanation. His neighbors were even asking if he was really the person who had been sitting there all these years begging. And when he told them that he was, then they demanded, well, then how are your eyes opened? And so what you see here is a group of people that instead of celebrating, they were seeking an explanation. Now, have you ever heard or seen someone question how authentic someone's conversion or baptism was? You know, somebody gets baptized, and maybe that day or later on you hear somebody say, I wonder if they really meant it. I wonder if they're really going to change. If so, that's very similar to what this man's neighbors were doing here. And so when they call him back and they ask him to explain it, he just tells them, I don't understand. Basically, I don't understand how it was done. I just know that I was blind, Jesus healed me, and now I can see. So Jesus asked this man later on in the story, he's like, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man he had healed says, who is it? Tell me so that I can believe. And Jesus let him know that he was the Son of Man. And this is what we read in verse 38. He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And that's what God is looking for from his creation. Not just people who believe. Lots of people can believe. But he's looking for people who believe and worship him. When we truly believe in Jesus, we will worship him. Or we can just show up, we can go through the motions, and we can still not worship. See, because this man had responded to Jesus, he received not only his sight, but he also received the full light of who Jesus is. So as we close, think about this man's transformation right here. We didn't read these parts, but in verse 11, he talks about Jesus as being a good man. A few verses later, in verse 17, he calls him a prophet. Now he's a great man. By the end of this chapter, he knows Jesus as being a man from God. And so just as with people like Augustine, just as with people like this man born blind, so many other people throughout history and us today, when we open our eyes to see Jesus, we'll be transformed to see just who Jesus really is. And today we saw that he is the divine ophthalmologist. I want to thank you for joining us here this evening for our Midweek with Double Creek time. We hope you can join us next time. Remember, we meet in person on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock, and we air it on Thursdays. Also, you can join us on Sunday mornings, 10 o'clock for our Sunday school, 11 o'clock for our church service, or visit our website. We hope you're doing well and staying safe. God bless.